Welcome back to Casual EDH. This is Chris, and today we are going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is mana ramp. So for this video, I just want to define mana ramp as something that actually gets you basically permanent mana on the field. There are three primary types, and then there's also some miscellaneous ones. This video here is going to talk about primarily land ramp, which is getting additional lands onto the battlefield. But there are also mana rocks and mana dorks, which are artifacts and creature-based, respectively. So, before we begin, I just want to let you know that I have been reviewing my previous recordings, and I'm trying to fix issues I've seen with those recordings. I'm very new to recording, and so there's definitely some growing pains there. So hopefully this video should be a little bit less shaky, less autofocus. Hopefully the sound turns out fine, things like that. But that said, let's begin. So when we talk about mana ramp, specifically land ramp, you're going to be having, there's primary two types, right? There's ones that get you out basic lands, and there's ones that get you out non-basic lands. So just for a quick refresher for anyone who is unsure, basic lands include mountains, plains, forests, islands, swamps, and of course, psychic. Shit. That's not right. Right, no one plays mountains in EDH. Mountain, plains, forest, island, swamp are the basic land types. Almost every form of land ramp will be able to get you at least one of these, but there are other ones that you can get. So I'm going to also show some non-basic lands that are going to be somewhat important for this video. Beyond the basic land types that we have here, we also have some non-basic ones. So I just have a few that I want to point out. This is not going to be a comprehensive list. I'm actually just showing examples for these because a lot of these comes in tens, and I'm not going to go through every single one of them. Alright, so for non-basic lands, we have things like Shocklands, Temple Gardens, and Stomping Grounds. These are important because they do have the basic land types on them. This one is Forest Plains, this one's Mount Forest as an example. These ones can come to play untapped if you pay 2 life, that's why they're called Shocklands. And so if you are looking at your land ramp cards and they say bring a card into play, not come to play tapped, you can bring these out by paying the 2 life. Basically, they would just follow their normal comes into play rules. Triumphs have been pretty popular since they came out in Ikoria. They have enemy wedges in Ikoria, and then they had allied wedges in Capenna. So these ones will always come into play tapped if they have 3 basic land types on them. So if you're playing a 3-color deck, these are basically a bad command tower. But they are searchable through a lot of the land ramps. You have some other miscellaneous ones like Cinderglade here. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands, which means it has ways of coming into play untapped. It is searchable. It's Mountain Forest, so it's kind of like Stomping Ground in that respect. But then you also have even more ones. So you have like Gingerbread Cabin. It's a forest. It can come into play tapped or untapped, and actually as an effective comes to play untapped. That one is from Eldraine. And then if we go back to like Lorwyn blocks, you have like Leechrain Swamp. There's a cycle of those. It comes into play tapped and then also has an effect on it, but it does have a basic land type swamp on it. And then in Kaldheim, for example, you also have these snow lands that are also plain swamps. Or this one's plain swamp, but there's an entire cycle of them, all 10 of them. So these are important to note because, again, you can just get them all through various land ramp sources. So I'll be talking about those on an individualistic basis. Other lands that are important to know about, you have, of course, your fetch lands. These themselves do not ramp, but there are tricks to make them into ramp. So I'll be talking about that at the end of the video. And then this one is really tricky. I don't feel like people played enough. It's Flagstones of Trocaire. It's a legendary land. It does not come into play tapped, so you can get white mana as soon as it comes into play. But it also has, when it is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may search your library for a plains card, not a basic plains, a plains card, and put it in the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So it replaces itself if it gets destroyed, but of course it's Magic. You can abuse the heck out of that and actually turn that into ramp, or to make certain ramp even better. So I'm going to be keeping this to the side because we will be talking about it again in some very specific circumstances. I'll also put that to the side, and we will move on. The thing about land ramp is that it's primarily a green thing. That is just green's color pie attribute to it. So most of the land ramp cards are going to be green. I'm going to talk about some non-green ones. So I'm going to try. So I don't want to say that any particular land ramp is bad. Anything that gets you lands can be good in certain circumstances, but there are some that are more universally useful. So, for example, 3 Visits, Nature's Lore. These are basically identical prints to each other. They have 2 different names, so you can use them both in a commander deck, but they both do the same thing. Search your deck for a forced card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. Not tapped. So if we go back to, where is it? Right here. Stomping Ground. Both of these can get out Stomping Ground because Stomping Ground is a mountain, and because it does not come into play tapped specifically from the card itself, it will allow you to pay the 2 life to bring Stomping Ground into play untapped. If you have the Cinderglade from before and you meet its conditions, it can come into play untapped. If you have a Taiga, because you have lots of money, it can come into play untapped. Is it Taiga? Is Taiga the red-green one? Doesn't matter anyway, someone can correct me. I'm sure there's probably someone who will make a comment. It's fine. But yeah, so these are really good. One of the good things about these also is that they're 2 mana, right? So when you're ramping, timing matters. Mana matters more at the very beginning of the game and at the very end of the game. So the sooner you can get your lands out, your extra ramp out, the better. And one of the things about these is that these are both 2 mana, so you can get, theoretically turn 2 you can bring out extra land. Another good 2-drop here is Rampant Growth. It only searches for a basic and it does come into play tapped, but you know what? This is price-wise less expensive. Also for 2 mana, much more easily obtainable. These are... Nature's Lore doesn't get reprinted very often, but it has been reprinted recently. 3 Visits was in, I think, Portal 2, and then it wasn't reprinted again until Commander Legends, and this is, this right here is from the Baldur's Gate Commander decks, and I think it's its actual 3rd reprint, but this one was only in the structure, whereas in Commander Legends it was in the boosters. So as far as obtainability, Rampant Growth is going to be easier for you to get, but if you do have the ability to get these and use these, do it. And also right now they are at a historical low, so if you can afford them, now's also a good time to buy them. If you want something that works functionally like Rampant Growth, but you feel like you need to have a body, we do have Steve, Sack Tribe Elder. He does have Sacrifice himself. Search your library for a basic land card, put that card on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. He is 2 mana, he's a 1/1. You can use him to chump block something, or not chump block, but yeah, just put him in front of something. They're considered blocked, you don't take damage, you can sack him, get your land. The only thing with Steve here is that a lot of people like to hold on to him for too long. Realistically, he should only be surviving 1 turn cycle. When it's the person in front of you's end phase, you should be sacking him off to get the land. Some people want to get that absolute maximum amount of value, which is the chump block, and honestly, getting the land's more important. So do what you can, but you need to use him as soon as possible. That's my only recommendation for him. If you want another 2 mana ramp, because 2 mana ramp is, I feel, the best ramp, Farseek. So this one actually lets you search for a plains, island, swamp, or mountain. So unlike Nature's Lore, unlike 3 Visits, it does not search for a forest. It searches for literally anything else. So again, this card can still get out Stomping Ground, because Stomping Ground is a mountain. But you can also use it to get something like a Breeding Ground, which is Simic. You can get a Sacred Foundry, which is Boros. Because of the way it's worded. So this is great for tricolor decks, but I would even use it in anything that's 2-color with green. A couple more staples you're going to see frequently are Kodama's Reach and Cultivate. These are functional reprints of each other, kind of like Nature's Lore and 3 Visits. So both of them lets you search your deck for 2 basic lands, put 1 to play tapped, 1 into your hand. So this helps you get colors if you need them. It does give you a 1-turn ramp and also gives you a drop for your next turn. The only difference between them is that Kodama's Reach is an arcane. This was something that was done in Kamigawa block. There are cards that have, quote, spice onto arcane, so basically you can reveal them, pay an additional cost, and then their effect gets tacked onto this card. There's so few of those, and they're so irrelevant, it doesn't necessarily matter. You might be able to do that on occasion, but the only problem with that is really you want to be playing Kodama's Reach on turn 3 if you can, and those ones you have to pay 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever mana. So theoretically you're not playing Kodama's Reach on turn 3 if you want to get the maximum effect, so it's kind of like the Steve thing. So largely they're irrelevant, and they can also kind of trick you into hurting yourself by not getting your lands when you want them. So be careful about that, but again, it's not something that really matters a whole lot because you're not going to see it very often. Something else that you're going to see somewhat frequently, Migration Path. It's 4 mana, which is a little bit high for land ramp, but it gets you 2 lands into play immediately, which is really good. So that's kind of like where I like to top out on my mana curve as far as getting additional lands into play. This one puts up to 2 basic land cards onto the battlefield, tap, but it does also have cycle 2. So if you don't need the land, say it's late game, you don't need the lands, but you do need a card draw, you can actually turn this into a card draw. It's really nice in that respect. There are other cards similar to it. I'm not going to talk about them because they basically do the same thing except they don't have cycling. I am, however, going to talk about Skyshroud Claim. Skyshroud Claim is search your library for up to 2 forest cards, put them on the battlefield, then shuffle your library. It's very important wording here. First of all, it can bring out shock lands or anything that just says forest on it. So again, you can search out for multicolored lands with these under those conditions. However, it also puts them on the battlefield. Does not say tapped, which means they do not need to come into play tapped. So if you can get this on turn 2, 3, or 4, you can just keep ramping. This could easily turn into like a turn 1 land, Soul Ring, turn 2 land, Skyshroud Claim, get 2 lands out, and then like a Signet, and then you have like 7 mana going into turn 3. You can do a lot of things with 7 mana on turn 3 that the table's not going to like. That's an ideal situation, but in any circumstance, just having 2 untapped lands come into play is really, really good. So if you are going to go for a 4 mana one, I do recommend Skyshroud Claim. For a common, it's actually kind of expensive price-wise, but right now it's still cheaper than it has been a while because it was last reprinted in Battlebond. So now's the time for a good pickup here. Some other notable ones, Roiling Regrowth, Harrow, Springbloom Druid. So all these are very similar to each other in how they work, but they do things a little bit differently. So each one of these is sacrifice a land, search your library for 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield. Springbloom Druid and Roiling Regrowth put them into play tapped. Harrow does not. Roiling Regrowth is an instant. Harrow is an instant, which means that Harrow is technically strictly better. It is what it is. Roiling Regrowth is a more recent print. And since they are very similar to each other and because they are at instant speed, it's, it just lets you have 2 Harrows in the deck. Springbloom Druid is a creature, which is really good because if you have animation effects, so you can keep getting out of your graveyard. Maybe you're using Nethroi and you just want to keep bringing him out because he's a 1 power and it doesn't take a whole lot of your reanimation there. You can just keep cycling stuff. And this is where we're going to start looking at Flagstones of Trocaire, like I talked about before. Because normally you sacrifice a land and then you get 2 lands, which means you gain 1 land total. But if you sacrifice Flagstones of Trocaire, you sacrifice Flagstones and then you get the Plains card plus the 2. So it turns these cards into +2 instead of +1. So that's really nice. Now, because there isn't really too much of a downside for playing Flagstones in the first place, if you are playing Selesnya or any combination with green or white, I recommend Flagstones of Trocaire if you have any of these ramp in it. Even if you don't get it off, or don't get off very frequently, it doesn't matter, because again, Flagstones does not hurt you to play. It does not come into play tapped. It just taps for white, so it gets you your color. It does not put you back a turn, and then you do get the sometimes effect for getting a Plains out. Some other fairly similar cards, you have Farhaven Elf, Yavimaya Dryad, and Wood Elves. These all do pretty much the same thing. They're all creatures. They all come into play, and they have an effect to get you a land. If you have like a Yarok or a Panharmonicon, you get a couple lands, which is kind of nice. Good thing about being creature-based. Farhaven Elf gets you a basic land to play tapped. Wood Elves gets you a forest into play, not tapped. And then Yavimaya lets you put a forest from your deck onto anyone's field because of the wording on it, but it is tapped. You're almost always going to be choosing yourself for that. I don't know why you would want to choose anyone else, but you could theoretically if you need to like end a menace and they were like 1 mana short. But yeah, Wood Elves is probably the best one out of these 3 in my opinion. Some other ones just to keep in mind, Beanstalk Giant, because it has the adventure effect. It's 3 mana to get 1 land, but he comes into play as a giant creature later. And because it's adventure, he gets exiled when that happens, so he's protected. So useful for like a landfall deck or something where you get a ton of lands out. Circuitous Root lets you search your deck for up to 2 basic land cards or gate cards. Put them on the battlefield, tap, and shuffle your library. So this kind of goes like Migration Path and the other ones, except this one can search out for any gate card. And gate cards have been getting a lot of support lately, and terms like Baldur's Gate. The Baldur's Gate set had several gates in it. Some of them are useful, some of them aren't. And then, of course, all of the Ravnica gates. So you have all of the clans, or whatever you want to call them there. They'll have their own gates. So you can do a lot of color fixing with that card really easily. Far Wanderings. It's another 3 mana that lets you search your library for a basic land put into play tapped. It does have threshold, though. If you have 7 more cards in your graveyard, instead search your library for up to 3 basic land cards put on the battlefield tapped. So 3 mana for 3 cards is really good if you're playing a mill deck. I mentioned Nethroi earlier. I play Nethroi self-mill, so this becomes a really good ramp for that kind of deck. Search for Tomorrow is 3 mana for 1 basic land, or it has Suspend 2 in green, so you can play this on turn 1 and then ramp automatically on a future turn. Spoils of Victory. You do not hear about this card very often. Search your library for a Plains, Island, Swamp, Mountain, or Forest card. Put that card onto the battlefield and shuffle your library. So it comes into play untapped, if the card would normally come into play untapped, and it searches for any of the basic land types, but it does not specify a basic land. So again, you get some color fixing there. Reaver Druid. If you don't mind ramping your enemies, you can get more ramp out of it. Comes into play. Each opponent gets to search your deck for up to 3 basic lands. They give you one of the basic lands that they find and keep the others and put them into play. And all the ones that you get to put into play. So theoretically, you can get 3 lands out of this, plus a 2/1 body, and they get 2 lands out of that. Not really a whole lot more to say about that. It can get you a lot of ramp, but it is giving your opponents lands as well. So it just kind of pushes the game forward. And then I'm just going to put one card out here to just talk about a general group of cards, and that's Big Land. So there are several cards that just cost a lot of mana or have a lot of hoops, and they can get you a lot of lands out. In this case, Reshape the Earth, 9 mana, search your deck for up to 10 land cards. Land cards, not basic, not type specific, just any land. You can get like Urborg and Cabal Coffers with this. Search your library for up to 10 land cards, put them on the battlefield, tap and shuffle your library. 9 mana sounds like a lot, and it is in a lot of circumstances. If you're playing Gruul, though, you do have a lot of ways to cheat out a lot of mana very quickly. And of course, green does that pretty well itself. But you can do like a Jeskai's Will, or like a Mana Geyser or something to get the colorless requirement. So then you just need to basically have the 3 green, then you can just play out most of the rest of the lands in your deck and probably proceed to roll Faiths for the rest of the match, however long that match may be. But I don't generally include cards like this into my decks. I just think they're too expensive mana-wise to do so. I don't want to get stuck with this on like turn 2 or 3 and just be sitting on it the whole game. So that goes through most of the green instant sorceries, creatures, whatever. So now I'm going to want to talk about some more, like, maybe not color specific. The first one, Corrosive Verge, is the most color specific one here. It comes into play tapped. It has tap to add for colorless, and it has 2 tap sack. Search your library for a forest card and a plains card. Put them on the battlefield, tap, and search your library, or shuffle your library. I find this really solid anything that has green and white. If you have other land-based ramps like Myriad Landscape, which does work for any deck, it basically is the same thing, except it lets you get better cards, basically. But Myriad Landscape, on the other hand, is also very similar. Enters the battlefield tapped, add colorless, 2 tap sack, search for 2 basic lands of the same type, put them on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. This will go into any deck, any color. Does not require green. Whereas this one is, since it's searching for forests and plains, you are going to be stuck in a deck with forests and plains. This can search for shock lands, dual lands, anything like that. This is stuck with basic lands. Use Corrosive Verge if you can. Use Myriad Landscape and everything else. Temple of the False Gods, technically land ramp because it does have add 2 colorless. A lot of people say it's a bad ancient tomb. Probably right. But because you can only activate if you control 5 or more of the lands. So on turn 3, 4, 5, when you have... basically, this is your 5th land, it's ramp. Otherwise, it kind of gets stuck out there, or it's really probably not that relevant. I don't usually include this in decks at all. Then if you want true colorless ramp, you have Solemn, Burnished Heart, Wayfarer's Bauble as examples. Solemn is 4 mana, comes into play, search your library for a basic land, put into play tapped, and then it has, when it dies, draw a card. This has been considered a staple in Commander EDH for a long time. People are veering away from it now because there are typically better options. But if you're not playing green, you're probably still playing this. And if you're doing any kind of artifact theme, you're playing this. Burnished Heart, 3 mana, and then 3 sacrifice it, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. So it's kind of like Mirrored Landscape in that respect, except it costs more, but you do get a 2/2 creature out of it. And you can split the mana cost over a couple turns. Wayfarer's Bauble. If you know who Mitch is, then you have probably heard all the arguments for this card. I would never play this in a green deck, but in literally anything else, I will play it every single time. It's 1 mana, and it has 2 sack, and then search your library for a basic land card, put into play, tap. So basically, for 1 mana, you get a colorless Rampant Growth that you then have to pay the Rampant Growth cost. So this costs 1 more mana overall than Rampant Growth, but you can still hit your turn 2 ramp with it in any color, which is kind of nice. Alright, so the last set of cards I want to talk about are what I call sometimes ramp. So these are cards like Exploration, cards like Ancient Green Warden, cards like Court of Bounty, cards like Coiling Oracle, cards like Uro, Explore. You have some situational ones like Broken Bonds, Burgeoning. So basically, the reason why these are sometimes ramp is because you kind of already have to be in a position where you can play additional cards. Let me explain. Exploration. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Great. You just have to have the ability to play an extra land on each one of your turns. So you have to have access to additional lands. If you don't, then at some point it's just going to be you put it out and then you're just still playing your 1 land per turn if you're lucky. It doesn't search for lands. So it's sometimes a ramp because you already have to have other cards in your hand. It's great with Nylea's Intervention. It's great with Crucible Worlds, which I will talk about. But it is still technically sometimes. Ancient Green Warden. I guess Ancient Green Warden is never technically ramp. This goes with Crucible of the World. So I'm actually going to hold off on talking about it, because what it does is it lets you play lands from your graveyard. Court of Bounty. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a land from your hand on the battlefield. So again, you have to have the additional land to be able to do that. Otherwise, that's just your land drop for the turn. However, I like this one because if you have the Monarch, you can also put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield instead. Broken Bond. It is 2 mana to destroy a target artifact or enchantment and then put a land card from your hand on the battlefield. Again, you have to have the land in your hand or else you're not going to actually ramp. Explore, draw a card, play an additional land. Okay, again, you have to have the land. Uro, Titans of Nature Wrath, which is basically explore, plus you gain some life. So again, you have to have the land in your hand. Coiling Oracle. It can come when it comes into play, look at the top card of your deck. If it's a land put into play, if it's not put in your hand. So again, situationally, it can ramp you, but don't count on it. Burgeoning. Whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land card from your hand on the battlefield. So again, if you have the lands in your hand and they're playing lands, you get to ramp. Otherwise, you don't. Also, it does specify hand. That's important. Again, these are all basically situational land ramp, but I'm going to hold on to Exploration and move the rest here, because now we're going to talk about ways of actually making this consistent ramp. So we have Ancient Green Warden lets you play lands from your graveyard. You can do that with Ramunap, Excavator, or Crucible of the Worlds as well. So basically what you can do is you can take a card like Burnt Catacombs. When you can play additional land per turn, and you can pull them from your graveyard, there's a very quick way where you can just cycle this, because this has tap, pay 1 life, search, sacrifice it, and then search your library for a Swamp or Forest card. Well, it goes in the graveyard. You can now play it again from your graveyard. You have Exploration, so it comes out. So basically, you search for your first land, and then you get to play it again, and then you get to search for your second one. That's ramp. There are lots of Exploration type effects. You have Azusa, Lost But Seeking, Mina and Den, etc., etc., etc. Not going to go through all of them. So theoretically, you could be doing this like 5 or 6 times in a turn. Another thing you can do is Flagstones of Trocaire. It's back again. I really like this card for dumb things. Because if you have something like a Zurin Orb out, you can sacrifice it to gain 2 life, search your library for a plains, put it into play, and then play this from your graveyard, do it again. Zurin Orb is an artifact, 0 mana, sacrifice a land, gain 2 life. It's a really bad card unless you're going to combo with it. So if you see someone play it, they're about to combo. Keep that in mind. You can use any fetch land of any type, basically. Almost any type. with something like this. Exploration and cards like it are sometimes ramp, but there are ways of making it more consistent to be able to do it over and over again. Something else you can do that does not involve this kind level of trickery: bounce lands. And this is where we're going to be ending the video today. So last thing I want to talk about, bounce lands. I don't generally like playing these. They are not really my shtick. But what you can do with cards like Exploration, if you're not doing the graveyard shenanigans, is you play like Selesnya Sanctuary, for example. Now, the reason why it's called a bounce land is because you're going to bounce a land that's in play back to your hand. Well, Exploration now lets you play an extra land, so then you play your other land back. So it's a way to get some additional ramp without having to like go through too many hoops. I really like land ramp compared to the other types. I think it's the most important one. I think it has the most little bitty bits to it. And I think it's important because there's less land destruction going around than there is like artifact or creature destruction. Now, that's not to say you can't get super degenerate with this, right? Going back to Crucible of the Worlds and Exploration effects, just because you're not counting on your lands getting destroyed, and that's why you're doing land ramp as opposed to artifact ramp or mana dork ramp, doesn't mean that you can't be destroying someone else's field. Strip Mine or Wasteland come to mind. They have tap, sack, destroy target land opponent controls, or non-basic land that an opponent controls, and then you can just bring it back with Crucible of the Worlds and just keep doing that. So basically you can use one of those to destroy multiple lands. Do that if you don't want to have friends. I don't personally do that, but I will tell you that you can do that because you can. Other than that, though, other than things like that, you know, lands are pretty sacred. People don't mess with them very often. So I do find the most important type of land ramp for the deck is land ramp because it's safe. But that said, I have said everything that I wanted to say on the topic. Thank you if you have actually been listening to this the entire time. I know it's kind of thick, but I appreciate it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing I've done with all my other videos so far. Let me find what I'm looking for here. If I was smart, I would have held it out, but you should know by now that I'm not that intelligent. So let's do this. I started this with my unboxing videos. I'm going to continue it here. If for some reason I ever get big and famous, here are 2 cards signed right on the video for you guys. Maybe as a gift, maybe as like a patron thing, maybe as a charity thing. I don't know. I'm not even going to see I'm going to get big enough, and these will probably end up in the trash someday. But if they don't, I hope someone enjoys them. That said, thank you again for showing up, for watching this, for being here with me. I hope you all have a good one.